Hey, I got a confession.
Welcome to the Indie Author Method, where we share insights from authors for you on your writing journey. On the weekends, when you have more time and space in your day, we sit down with another author to discuss their processes and what they can share with you. This episode is brought to you by Monk Manual. Monk Manual at its core is a 90-day productivity system, but it's much more than that. Monk Manual as a company is on a mission to fix modern productivity and help live fuller lives. Inspired by the wisdom of monks and rooted in psychology, they design practical tools for peaceful being and purposeful doing. They were so gracious to partner with the Indie Author Method, and you can check out their products, including the 90-day planner that I personally use, at their website, monkmanual.com. Be sure to use promo code AndrewJBrandt at checkout for 15% off your order. That's promo code, my name, all one word, AndrewJBrandt at monkmanual.com. Now on to the interview. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by Carl Albert. Carl's a screenwriter. He graduated from USC's School of Cinematic Arts. He's got a B.F.A. in writing for screen and television. And he's the author of a fantasy series, The Ash Eternal. Carl's book one, The Truth of Crowns, released earlier this year. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
I appreciate you taking down the picket for just a minute to come talk with us.
Yeah, of course. It's been hot outside recently, so glad to take a little
bring into the air conditioning a little bit.
Exactly.
Hey, let's talk about The Truth of Crowns. Let's talk about this fantasy series. What inspired you to write this book? Where'd you come up with the idea? How do you do this?
So the original idea came while I was in college, while I was in film school at USC, between my freshman and sophomore year. Certainly in film school, and I think this is true in any art school and any creative writing program, you're taught a lot of structures, a lot of, you could almost call them formulas behind writing. And I wanted to step away from that because I had particularly the 3-act structure that is so often taught in regards to screenplays, in regards to novels too, even. And so I wanted to write a book that was maybe a little more free-flowing, a little more unique in its structure. And I was always a really big epic fantasy fan. And I just gotten back into reading epic fantasy because of American Gods, because of Game of Thrones. So I thought I was very clever. I was like, what if I do Game of Thrones, but it's like the Renaissance, which is like the blandest, simplest, idea. And it turns out that a lot of other fantasy works had actually taken place in the Renaissance. I had since learned, but it evolved from there into something where, I knew I wanted a murder mystery element, and I knew I wanted to take aspects of my own life and my own personal experience and put them in the fantasy world. You often hear the saying, write what you know. And I think a lot of times people, especially when they're writing secondary worlds like Westeros or Narnia, have, maybe hesitate to kind of put their own real world experience into it because you're like, oh, it's so separate from our reality. And I was determined to find a way to make it work. So
yeah, sure.
As a baby, on the day I was born, I almost died. I had life-saving surgery. And the surgery did not exist 100 years ago, back during World War II, did not exist. And that was kind of a refrain I grew up hearing. And so I thought, well, what if someone was born with the same condition I had? My esophagus was connected to my lungs. I wondered, well, how would they survive in this world? And, because it's fantasy, you naturally have a little more flexibility. My thought was magic. And then I thought, well, okay, but I want there to be a consequence. I don't just want it to be this easy miracle fix, right?
Right.
And so I thought, okay, well, what if, to save your sickly newborn child, your only option left was to make a deal with the devil? And a whole plot line, a whole cast of characters really grew from that. And so that's where we have Truth of Crowns, which is a book about a large cast of characters, one of which deals with the plot line I mentioned. Another is a young, unproven prince who pursues the love of his life, a woman forbidden to him. And then we have other characters tying in from there in a big, grand political conspiracy.
Sure. That sounds really epic. But you had mentioned, in your answer, talking about Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Game of Thrones. I mean, these are cinematic and literary elements now. I grew up on a steady diet of Goosebumps and Stephen King's. What are some of the books, or what are some of the authors that you grew up with, and how did they kind of influence or impact your writing style?
Oh yeah. I'm a big Stephen King fan. He definitely is a big influence on me, particularly in the way he writes people in horrific and fantastic environments. Like, his characters feel so real to me. A
Yeah.
lot of the time, I think he's really great at writing children, and that was something I tried to evoke in Truth of Crowns. J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series, I'm very much a man of my generation in that, I grew up reading Harry Potter and watching the movies. I read the books multiple times. As a nerdy kid with glasses, it meant a lot to me that there was actually a main character, who had glasses. Like, as small as that is, that little bit of
Yeah.
representation mattered to me. And I would also say the willingness of Harry Potter to kill characters, beloved characters, imprinted on me from a very young age. So by the
Yeah.
time I got to something like Game of Thrones, which does it to, the next level, it felt very natural to me and very exciting. And I was like, that's the type of storytelling I want to do, where you feel like anyone could die at any time.
Yeah.
And so that definitely translated to the work I write now, both in terms of screenplays and this fantasy series, The Ash Eternal, where I wanted the stakes to be really high. I wanted you to worry about all of our POV characters, all of our non-POV characters, everyone involved in this story. And so that, I would say, were probably some of the biggest influences for me growing up.
When you were talking about, being a screenwriter and talking about, the 3-act structure, I'm a huge fan of Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. Jessica Brody wrote Save the Cat Writes a Novel. It's taking those screenwriting elements and transposing them into novel writing, following the beats, the story beats, the 3-act structure. My writing process tends to follow that beat sheet. Can you tell us about your writing process? I mean, do you have any particular rituals or habits? Whenever you sat down to write this novel, what did that look like?
Absolutely. I would say my process definitely varies project to project. The big consistency is that I will try to outline, and I will start writing to the outline, and then it will veer way off course. That I'll I try really hard to be an outliner, especially because in Hollywood, everyone expects you to outline. Execs want an outline before you're ever greenlit to write a screenplay.
Sure.
And so I have a lot of practice outlining, but I always end up just finding the characters would not do the things I want them to do, or the outline has enormous plot holes and things like that. And so I'll still have ideas from the outlines. I still have a general idea of where the story's going, but often it's a much more free flowing process for me.
Sure.
It's interesting too, when talking about kind of the process of this book, just because it was written over 6 years off and on. I wasn't writing it consistently, particularly while I was in school, just because I was working on so many different scripts at the time.
Okay.
And as I kind of came back to it, I actually found the structure and kind of my process, my approach through another book that I really love called Into the Woods. I'm blanking on the writer's name right now, but it basically is a book that tries to set out and say, actually, the 5-act structure is the universal structure and blah, blah, blah. But it's true in films and books and whatever. And while I kind of disagree with the universality of it, and I chafe against anyone who tries to argue that there's one true structure that every story fits in. The structure presented in that book was particularly interesting to me because it was the 5-act structure that Shakespeare unconsciously used. Shakespeare did not use 5 acts, but when we took his plays, when we started collecting them, we put them in 5 acts, and they all naturally fell into that. It happened to be kind of the way he wrote stories.
Sure.
And there's a very specific rhythm and turning and pacing to a 5-act structure. And as my Truth of Crowns, one of the influences I didn't mention was Shakespeare. I very quickly realized I was writing, particularly in this first book, a tragedy and kind of a classical tragedy. And I leaned into that, particularly on the rewrites. And I reshaped it to fit into the 5 acts of classical tragedies. And so I found that Into the Woods, this book, really was huge for me in terms of my process in rewriting and finding the structure and finding the feel and the approach to the finished work.
No, I love that. I'm a huge Shakespeare nerd too. Um, I recently saw a production of Romeo and Juliet. I'd never seen Romeo and Juliet, and finally got an opportunity to see that. And it was kind of cool because at the same time I was working on a Romeo and Juliet retelling,
Very
and
cool.
to be able to really dissect the play as written reads one way, but to actually get to see it performed, you pick up on so many different intricacies of the performance that just doesn't come across in the printed text.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really is night and day in that way. I mean, I think Shakespeare can still be fun to be read, but it really is meant to be watched. It's meant to be performed, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true with like screenplays too, right? You know, he wrote these scripts for actors to act out, and it really does open up a whole another level of storytelling. Like you said, a lot of the intricacies, a lot of the nuances don't present themselves necessarily on the page, but you see once you have a director interpreting the work and actors interpreting the work and
Sure.
getting to see it come to life. It really is an amazing thing.
Andrew Van Way is a horror writer. He's a friend of mine who's a screenwriter in Hollywood before the 2008 strikes. He was talking about how screenwriting was a very collaborative document, whereas in novel writing, it was just the complete opposite of that. You kind of hole up and create the story yourself, and you don't have, editors and producers and directors, all putting into this collaborative document like you do with a screenplay. Going back to your book though, what are some of the challenges? I mean, you talked about, how you took several years to write this book. You went away from it. You can't. What are some of those challenges that you faced for it, and how'd you overcome them?
The number one challenge was just finding time to write it,
Yeah.
particularly in like the first half of the writing process was,
Right.
I started it the summer before my sophomore year of college, and it kind of tied into that, perhaps an understated aspect of that challenge is when you write something over a longer period of time, you
Yeah.
change as a person. Your
Mhm.
opinions change. I grew up a lot in those times. I went through, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you all the things, people I cared about died. Like, my worldviews changed. I had my first like very serious, long-term, several year long romantic relationship. And, that came and went, and, I changed a lot. And so the story changed naturally too, and adapting over that and making sure that the end work is, that it doesn't contradict itself, that
Yeah, sure.
it all fits together, despite the fact that it was written over such a long period of time, is a challenge in and of itself. And in many ways is the biggest challenge where, when it says something as small as, say, a continuity error, which are already so difficult when you're writing like a big kind of expansive world building heavy story like an epic fantasy. But it was certainly was made even more difficult just by the fact that, I would come back to it after several months of not writing. And it helped that in the last push beginning, I graduated into COVID. And so for the first kind of year after that, all I was doing really was writing. And that helped me kind of finish the first draft and get a second draft done and work through kind of the biggest kinks and getting a feel for the type of story. That's when I figured out, I was like, oh, this is a tragedy. And, it didn't mean that it was necessarily, it was far from perfect then. And there were still a lot of big changes that went through. And I guess that would be the other challenge was, once I got an editor, I paid an amazing editor who'd worked on traditionally published fantasy novels. AP Canavan, he's on YouTube under the name A Critical Dragon. I'm a big fan of his, and he worked on the Malazan Book of the Fallen fantasy series, and he's incredibly smart. And we've saw stories in a very similar way, which is why I reached out to him. And thankfully we got along. We did kind of a test. He like went through my prologue and edited it and was like, does this seem like the sort of thing you'd like? Do we get along? That sort of thing. And thankfully we did. But then you get an editor to come in, and suddenly you're dealing with, someone's very shrewd opinions.
Yeah.
Some of which you may disagree with, a lot of which you will not. And then having to adapt to that. And that was my first time working with an editor. And so that was sort of a new process. And thankfully, because of film school and at least the program I went to at USC, I was very used to getting notes. I had a writers group who the entire time I was writing the book was like giving me notes. I would send in chapters and they would, return with their opinions, their critiques, the things they liked. But it's still a challenge, and particularly when you're trying to make big changes, but maintain the core of the story you wanted to tell.
Yeah. I think Neil Gaiman talks about that, like writing groups and writing critique. And he says that if somebody says something's wrong with your story, they're probably right. But whatever they say that you need to or how you need to change it, they're probably wrong.
Right. Exactly. I've seen that quote, and that I've always felt that is so true. So often, occasionally I will have someone in my writers group or, an editor present an idea and I'll be like, oh, that's really good. But oftentimes what they'll say, you're like, no, but because that causes problems like XYZ, or like, no, that like betrays what I'm going for with this character. And yet that they are touching on something that is very real. And, in the film industry, we call it the note behind the note. Oftentimes when you're dealing with executives, they'll give you a note and it sounds like the worst thing you've ever heard. But there is something there where they're touching, they can't quite express what it is that they feel is wrong, but they're touching on something, like a character isn't relatable enough, or like this subplot drags or what have you. And so it's your job to go in and figure out what is that note behind the note, and how do I, while staying true to my original vision, fix the problem there. And I personally find that really fun. I like rewriting way more than I like writing. Like first drafts are the worst part for me. I like discovering characters. Like the first drafts
are often true screenwriter.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. I would much rather just like come in and, fix. I mean, God, I particularly coming in, if you rewrite someone else's work, it's like you see it with fresh eyes, and, you don't have the biases. I think that's a lot of what, when you're talking about like a screenplay being collaborative, like that's a lot of where that comes in, particularly features where it'll get rewritten by other people, and there's issues that way. But anyway, oh God, I love rewriting and hate first drafts. Hate first drafts so much.
With The Truth of Crowns, what's the message or the main takeaway that you hope readers get from that book?
Oh man, that is a big question. Thematically, there is a lot going on. I think in some ways it's a plea for compassion in the face of systemic injustices, to kind of see everyone as people and not just as necessarily what has been done to them or the systems they're a part of. On another hand, it is a kind of systemic critique, particularly of monarchy and notions of hero worship and stuff like the divine right of kings and the great chain of being that is plays a big role in Shakespeare's works, and is still something you see in the real world today, that like just being born into a position, you inherently deserve to inherit a certain amount of power and wealth and influence, and like the flaws therein. And there is a very real critique there, but also a plea for compassion, that just because someone is maybe born into an oppressive position does not necessarily mean that they are inherently corrupt or evil either, and kind of trying to balance the nuances there. I think it's also, the series as a whole is really concerned with, are human beings inherently good? Are they inherently bad? Or really, when you get into the thick of it, are they redeemable? And I think this is a question that there maybe isn't a clear answer for ever, and I don't know if the work will ever answer it directly. But like we're dealing with stuff like climate change. Certainly, we've committed a lot of atrocities over time, and the question is very much, are we kind of destined for self-destruction, or are we, do we even deserve to be saved? And that's something that I think about a lot. And kind of existential questions about how small we are in the grand scope of the universe, and those sorts of things, and is something that I really wanted to explore with this series, particularly because fantasy is such a great medium to literalize through like symbols, for example, and through magic, very complex, issues, feelings, that sort of thing, where you can take the invisible and make it visible. You can take the unreal and make it real. And it's so often concerned with morality tales. You think of stuff like Lord of the Rings, the battle between good and evil. And that was something that I kind of wanted to explore and maybe deconstruct some traditional views, but also deconstruct some points of views of even works that are maybe have a grimmer view of the world, like Game of Thrones, which I love very much and is very clearly a huge influence. Yeah. But, there are times I think its view of either history or people or individual things I chafe against. And I find that writing a lot of times is a conversation with yourself, with the audience, but also with other writers and with other works of fiction. I know George R.R. Martin, part of his writing of the series was in response to Lord of the Rings. What he's kind of famous for being quoted saying, well, what's Aragorn's tax policy after he's king? It said he's a good king, but what does that mean? Yeah. And similarly, I feel my work is not just in conversation with George R.R. Martin, but a number of authors, and kind of talking about notions of power and morality and love and duty. So God, yeah, that was a very long, very complex answer to your question. I find it, in short, difficult to distill the book down into a specific theme, because I wasn't writing to one specific theme like oftentimes one might do in a shorter work. Like I had such a large cast of characters that I just found there are some through lines, but I just found it wasn't necessarily about one thing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and that's heavy stuff, especially talking about, writing in response to other creative works, and how you translate them in your own mind, and how you want to express that to readers as well.
Absolutely.
Carl, where can our listeners find Truth of Crowns?
So the ebook is Amazon exclusive. It is on Kindle Unlimited because of that, and just did that for royalties purposes. But the book you can find pretty much anywhere books are sold, particularly if you live in the US. I distribute through Ingram Spark, which I recommend any self-published author to. Yeah, and go ahead. You can buy it through Barnes and Noble. You can buy it through indie bookstores. They can order it, or you can order it through Amazon. Whatever you want to do.
Yeah, Carl, I found you on TikTok. Where can our viewers or listeners find you online?
TikTok is a great place. In general, on social media, you can find me at Carl D. Albert, which is my pen name. And yeah, just at Carl D. Albert. I also have a website, www.carldalbert.com. Cool. You can message me there. You can send me an email, that sort of thing.
Cool. Fantastic. Carl, one more question before I let you go. This is going to happen. If it hasn't happened yet, somebody's going to come up to you. You're going to be signing books somewhere, and they're going to have a well-worn, huge copy of Truth of Crowns. And they're going to say, oh my gosh, this is my favorite book, and I want to write stories like this. What's your biggest piece of advice for me? So Carl D. Albert, what is that number one piece of advice for that aspiring author?
Persevere. And I think that's twofold. One, write, just keep writing. Do not stop writing. That's the number one thing you can control. You can't control how other people react to your work. You can't control if your work gets bought. You can't control how many people buy your work. You can certainly market it, but you can control the fact that you're writing. So keep writing and persevere. Emotionally, writing is a very hard hobby. It's a very hard career. As soon as you try to take it seriously, you're gonna have people who tell you, it's impossible, or you're not good enough, or who maybe any number of obstacles will present themselves.
Sure.
And you have to persevere. So persevere.
Yeah. Carl, man, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope all of our viewers and listeners check out your book. Check out Truth of Crowns, like I said, on Amazon or in paperback, wherever books are sold.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Appreciate it. That's our interview for the day. Thank you for tuning in, and remember to subscribe for more insights and wisdom for your writing journey at the Indie Author Method. Find us online at my website, www.andrewjbrandt.com.
I wanna dig my hands deep down in the dirt. Take a walk along the street if I'm feeling dessert. All of this couldn't be